The gavel came down like thunder, and I felt my entire world collapse into that single, devastating sound. Guilty on all counts. 26 months in federal prison for financial crimes I didn't commit, while my sister Ashley walked free, probably already planning her next shopping spree with dirty money. But that was 3 years ago, and today she has no idea what's coming for her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jazmin Miranda, and I used to believe that family meant everything. I used to think that protecting the people you love, even when they don't deserve it, was the highest form of loyalty. I was 24 when I learned that some families will throw you to the wolves without hesitation, and some love is nothing more than convenience wrapped in pretty words. It started on a Tuesday morning in March when the FBI knocked on our door at 6:30 a.m. I was still in my pajamas, nursing my first cup of coffee and scrolling through job listings on my laptop. Fresh out of graduate school with a degree in accounting, I was living back home in Phoenix while I searched for my first real career opportunity. The house on Maple Street had always felt safe, with its terracotta tiles and my mother's carefully tended garden full of desert roses and barrel cacti. That morning, safety shattered like glass. My father, Robert, answered the door, his face going white as he saw the badges. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the lead agent announced. "We have a warrant to search these premises in connection with suspected money laundering operations." My mother, Linda, dropped her coffee mug, the ceramic exploding across the kitchen. Floor in sharp fragments that seemed to echo the destruction about to rain down on our lives. Ashley emerged from her bedroom looking perfectly put together despite the early hour. Her blonde hair styled in loose waves, designer yoga pants that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. She worked as a consultant for various tech startups, though I'd never quite understood what that meant or why it required so much travel to Las Vegas and Miami. She made more money than anyone else in our family, driving a brand new BMW and carrying handbags that cost thousands of dollars. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice steady, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her gold bracelet. The agents began methodically searching our home, photographing documents, seizing computers, and asking pointed questions about financial transactions and business relationships. I watched my parents' faces crumble as the reality of the situation settled in. That's when my father pulled me aside, his voice urgent and desperate. "Jazmin, we need to talk." He led me to the back patio, away from the chaos inside. "Ashley is in serious trouble. They're saying she's been washing money through fake consulting contracts, using shell companies to move funds for some very dangerous people." My stomach dropped. "But Dad, if she's guilty—" He cut me off. "Listen to me carefully. Ashley has information about these people, names and locations that could get her killed if this goes to trial. She needs time to figure out how to protect herself." My mother joined us, tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, you just graduated. You don't have a criminal record. You're young. If someone has to take responsibility for this, the courts would be more lenient with you than with Ashley." The words hit me like ice water. "You want me to confess to her crimes?" My father nodded grimly. "Just until we can find another way. Ashley will figure something out. She always does. But right now, we need to keep her safe." I thought about Ashley's room, filled with designer clothes and expensive jewelry. I thought about how she'd always been the favorite, the golden child, who could do no wrong. When she crashed Dad's car in high school, I was grounded for 2 weeks because I'd supposedly been a bad influence. When she failed 3 classes her freshman year of college, my parents took out a second mortgage to pay for summer school and tutoring. When I graduated summa cum laude, they missed my ceremony because Ashley had a minor fender bender and needed emotional support. "She's your sister," my mother whispered. "Family protects family." Looking back, I realize now that they meant Ashley was family, and I was just the convenient scapegoat. But at 24, desperate to finally earn their approval and believing their promises that it would only be temporary, I agreed. The next weeks blurred together in a nightmare of legal meetings and coached testimonies. Ashley's expensive attorney, paid for by my parents' retirement savings, explained how I would claim responsibility for creating the shell companies and processing the transactions. "It's a simple narrative," he said, his suit probably worth more than my college tuition. "Young graduate student, desperate for money, gets in over her head with some bad people online. First offense, show remorse, you'll get minimal time." Ashley coached me on the details, sitting in our kitchen as if we were studying for a test. "The company names are Phoenix Digital Solutions and Desert Vista Consulting. You set them up using fake business licenses. The payments came through cryptocurrency exchanges, then you converted them to wire transfers." She spoke with the casual confidence of someone who'd actually lived these lies. "Remember, you were scared, you didn't know how deep you were getting. You thought it was just moving money for overseas clients." I memorized every detail, every fake invoice, every fabricated transaction. My parents watched with pride as I prepared to sacrifice my future for their favorite daughter. "You're doing the right thing," my father assured me. "This will all be over soon, and we'll be a family again." My mother bought me new clothes for court appearances, as if dressing nicely could somehow minimize the magnitude of what we were doing. The prosecution was eager to close the case quickly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They had their transactions, their documentation, and now they had a confession. My court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed and underfunded, advised me to take the plea deal. 2 years. You'll serve 18 months with good behavior. At your B age, you can rebuild. But Ashley's crimes weren't simple financial fraud. The money she'd laundered belonged to a drug trafficking organization with connections to violent cartels. The amounts were staggering. Over $2 million processed through accounts in my name, accounts I'd never opened but couldn't prove weren't mine. During the sentencing hearing, I watched my family from the defendant's table. Ashley sat in the gallery wearing a black dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue for the cameras. My parents held hands, playing the role of devastated family members whose youngest daughter had gone astray. The judge spoke about the seriousness of money laundering, about how these crimes funded violence and destroyed communities. "Miss Miranda," he said, looking directly at me, "you've pleaded guilty to processing over $2 million for criminal organizations. This court sentences you to 26 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation." The gavel fell, and my life as I knew it ended. Ashley's tears looked so genuine that for a moment, I almost believed she actually felt sorry for what she'd done to me. Federal prison was an education in survival I'd never wanted. My cellmate Rosa was serving 5 years for embezzlement, and she took me under her wing during those first terrifying weeks. "First time?" she asked, watching me try to navigate the complex social hierarchies and unwritten rules. I nodded, still in shock that this was actually my life now. "What did they get you for?" When I told her money laundering, she whistled low. "That's serious time for someone who looks like they've never jaywalked." Rosa was right. I'd never even gotten a speeding ticket before this. While other inmates had street experience, or at least knew what they were getting into, I was completely unprepared for the reality of incarceration. The constant noise, the lack of privacy, the way every day blended into the next in a haze of scheduled meals and monitored activities. I spent my time in the prison library, reading everything I could about financial crimes and legal procedures, trying to understand how I'd ended up here. Letters from home were sporadic and superficial. My mother wrote about her garden and the weather. My father sent newspaper clippings about local sports teams. Ashley sent a card on my birthday with a generic message about missing me, postmarked from Los Angeles, where she was apparently taking some time to heal from the family trauma. No one visited. They said it was too painful, too far to travel, too difficult to see me in that environment. But I started receiving letters from someone unexpected. My cousin David, who worked as a forensic accountant for a private investigation firm in Denver. We'd never been particularly close, but he'd followed the case and something about it bothered him. "The transaction patterns don't match your educational background or lifestyle," he wrote. "Someone with your training would have set up more sophisticated laundering schemes if they were actually guilty. This looks like amateur hour, which makes me think the real perpetrator wanted it to be obvious enough to trace back to someone else." David's letters became my lifeline. He explained how money laundering actually worked, the sophisticated methods real criminals use to hide their tracks. The more I learned, the more obvious it became that Ashley had deliberately set up these accounts to be traceable to me. She'd used my social security number, my date of birth, even my college email address in some of the applications. But she'd made small mistakes, little inconsistencies that a trained eye might catch. "I've been looking into your sister's travel patterns," David wrote 6 months into my sentence. "She's been to Las Vegas 12 times in the past 2 years, always staying at the same casino hotel. That's where a lot of money laundering happens, through gaming chips and high-stakes poker games. I think she's still active, just being more careful now." The thought that Ashley was continuing her criminal activities while I rotted in prison filled me with a cold rage I'd never experienced before. I began keeping detailed notes about everything David shared with me, everything I learned about financial crimes, every inconsistency in the case against me. Other inmates noticed my research habits. "You planning an appeal, college girl?" asked Maria, a woman serving time for tax evasion. When I explained my situation, her expression darkened. "Your own family set you up? That's lower than anything I've seen in here, and I've seen some cold-blooded stuff." The more I learned, the more I realized how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. Ashley hadn't just asked me to take the fall. She'd been setting me up for months. Before the FBI raid, bank accounts opened with my information, business licenses filed using my credentials, even a fake LinkedIn profile established in my name to support the consulting cover story. While I'd been focused on graduate school and job hunting, she'd been building an entire false identity around me. Rosa helped me understand something crucial about prison relationships and power dynamics. The people who survive in here aren't the loudest or the toughest, she explained during one of our late-night conversations. They're the ones who watch, who listen, who gather information and wait for the right moment to act. You've got something most of us don't have. You're actually innocent, and if you can prove it, you've got leverage. She was right. I had something that most inmates didn't, a legitimate grievance and the education to do something about it. I started corresponding with legal aid organizations, innocence projects, and investigative journalists who specialized in wrongful convictions. Most didn't respond, but a few showed interest in my case, particularly when I mentioned David's findings about ongoing criminal activity. The day I received David's letter about Ashley's latest Las Vegas trip, something inside me shifted permanently. She wasn't lying low or staying out of trouble. She was expanding her operations, probably feeling invincible after successfully framing me for her previous crimes. "She registered a new business entity last month," David wrote. "Desert Sunset Consulting, same type of setup as before. I think she's getting ready to process another major transaction." That night, lying in my narrow bunk while Rosa snored softly below me, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to prove my innocence. I was going to make sure Ashley faced consequences for what she'd done to me and what she was still doing to other victims. I was going to gather evidence, build an airtight case, and hand it to the authorities on a silver platter. But first, I had to survive the rest of my sentence and get back to the outside world. I had 8 months left, 8 months to plan and prepare for a confrontation that my family would never see coming. They thought they'd successfully buried their problem, that I'd take their secret to my grave out of misplaced loyalty. They had no idea that prison had taught me lessons they never intended for me to learn. Rosa noticed the change in me immediately. "You're different," she observed a few days later. "Calmer, but also more dangerous. What are you planning?" I smiled, probably the first genuine smile I'd managed in months. "I'm planning to be the daughter they raised me to be, loyal, protective, and dedicated to family justice. They just forgot that I'm family too." The woman who walked out of federal prison 18 months later bore little resemblance to the naive graduate student who'd walked in. I'd lost 20 pounds, gained muscle from the prison gym, and developed an understanding of human nature that no university course could have taught me. More importantly, I'd learned that real power comes from patience, preparation, and the willingness to strike when your enemies least expect it. My parents picked me up at the prison gates, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of relief and welcome. "We're so proud of how you handled everything," my mother said, hugging me with the same enthusiasm she'd show a distant relative. "Ashley's doing much better now. She started a new business, really turned her life around." My father nodded approvingly. This whole experience brought our family closer together. I smiled and said all the right things about second chances and moving forward. But inside, I was already planning their downfall. They had no idea that their loyal, sacrificial daughter had spent 18 months learning exactly how to destroy them using the same legal system they'd weaponized against me. Ashley had taught me how to be patient, how to plan, and how to strike without warning. Now it was time for the family to learn what real consequences looked like. The house on Maple Street looked exactly the same, but everything felt different through my eyes. The desert roses my mother had been so proud of were now professionally landscaped, and there was a new BMW in the driveway. Not Ashley's old one, but a newer model with temporary plates. As we pulled into the garage, I noticed my father's hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel. Prison had taught me to read people's nervous tells, and Robert Miranda was definitely nervous. "We've prepared your old room," my mother said as we walked through the kitchen. The space had been remodeled since I'd been gone. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, custom cabinets that probably cost more than most people's annual salary. Ashley helped us pick out the finishes. She has such an eye for design. Of course she did. Ashley had always had expensive taste, and now apparently she could afford to indulge it without any concern for where the money came from. My childhood bedroom had been transformed too. The twin bed I'd slept in through high school was gone, replaced by a queen-size bed with hotel-quality linens. New furniture, new curtains, even new carpet. "We wanted you to be comfortable," my father explained, but I could see the real message. They'd erased every trace of who I used to be, creating a sanitized space for the daughter they expected me to remain. Grateful, compliant, and silent. "Where's Ashley?" I asked casually, unpacking the single bag of belongings I'd been allowed to take to prison. Most of my possessions had been sold or donated while I was gone, another small erasure in the systematic elimination of my previous life. "Oh, she's in California this week," my mother replied quickly. "Business meetings, but she's so excited to see you when she gets back." That first dinner back home was a masterclass in family theater. My parents had ordered takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant, the kind of place we'd only gone for special occasions when I was growing up. They asked carefully neutral questions about my plans for the future, my health, whether I needed anything. Nobody mentioned the elephant in the room, the fact that I'd spent 18 months in federal prison for crimes I didn't commit, while the real criminal lived freely in luxury. "We've been thinking," my father said over dessert, "maybe you should consider moving somewhere fresh. Start over in a new city where nobody knows about your past." My mother nodded enthusiastically. Seattle's nice, or maybe Portland. Somewhere progressive where people believe in second chances. The suggestion hit me like a slap. They wanted me gone, shipped off to some distant city where I couldn't accidentally expose their comfortable lies. I was thinking I'd stay here. For a while, I said carefully, watching their faces. Get my bearings, maybe look for work locally. The tension in the room was immediate and palpable. My parents exchanged one of those married couple glances that communicate volumes without words. Of course, my mother said, her smile brittle. Take all the time you need. We just want what's best for you. What was best for me, apparently, was staying as far away from Ashley and her ongoing criminal enterprise as possible. Over the next few days, I began to understand the delicate ecosystem my family had created around my sister's activities. Ashley was described as traveling for work or consulting with clients whenever she disappeared for days or weeks at a time. Her expensive purchases were explained as business investments or client entertainment expenses. The family had become experts at not asking questions they didn't want answered. My cousin David called on my third day home, and my mother's face went pale when she handed me the phone. It's David, she said unnecessarily, hovering nearby as if she wanted to monitor the conversation. I took the phone to my room and closed the door, but I could hear her footsteps pacing in the hallway outside. How are you holding up? David asked, his voice warm with genuine concern. Better than expected, I replied honestly. Prison was educational. David had continued his investigation while I was incarcerated, and what he'd discovered was both fascinating and terrifying. Ashley hadn't just continued her money laundering operation, she'd expanded it significantly. She's processing money for at least 3 different criminal organizations now, he explained. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, and what looks like some kind of cryptocurrency fraud scheme. The amounts are staggering. We're talking about $10 to $15 million over the past year alone. The scope of Ashley's crimes took my breath away. While I'd been locked in a federal facility, eating prison food and sharing a cell with a tax evader, my sister had been building a criminal empire that dwarfed her previous activities. How is she not caught? I asked, genuinely puzzled. She's gotten much more sophisticated, David replied. Multiple shell companies, offshore accounts, cryptocurrency mixers, real estate transactions. She's learned from her mistakes. Her mistakes. The mistakes that had sent me to prison while she walked free. I felt that familiar cold rage settling. In my chest, the emotion that had sustained me through the worst days of incarceration. David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. He waited. Do you think there's enough evidence to build a case against her now? The pause was long enough that I thought we'd been disconnected. Finally, David spoke, his voice carefully measured. Potentially, yes, but it would require someone with inside access to gather the kind of evidence that would stick. Someone she trusts completely. The implication hung in the air between us. Someone like a sister who just got out of prison for the same type of crimes, I said. Someone she'd never suspect of turning against the family. We talked for another hour, with David explaining the types of evidence that would be most valuable. Financial, records, communication logs, transaction details, and most importantly, information about her current clients and their criminal enterprises. The FBI has been watching her, he admitted. But she's careful now. They need someone on the inside to get the smoking gun evidence. As we ended the call, I realized that my family's plan to keep me close but powerless had actually created the perfect opportunity for me to destroy them all. Ashley returned from California on a Thursday evening, sweeping into the house like a conquering hero returning from battle. She'd always had a flair for dramatic entrances, but now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed. She was untouchable. Jazmin, she exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug that felt like a performance for our parents' benefit. You look amazing. Prison really agreed with you." The comment was typically Ashley, seemingly supportive, but with a subtle knife twist that reminded me of exactly where I'd been while she'd been living her best life. She was tan from her California trip, her hair professionally highlighted, wearing clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Diamond earrings caught the light as she moved, and her manicured nails were painted a shade of red that reminded me of fresh blood. "I brought you a present," she said, producing a designer handbag from one of her shopping bags. "I thought you might need something nice for job interviews." The bag was beautiful and expensive, but I could see the calculation behind the gift. Ashley was trying to buy my continued silence, offering me pretty things in exchange for keeping family secrets. I accepted the bag graciously, but inside I was cataloging every detail of her appearance and behavior for the case I was building against her. That night at dinner, Ashley regaled our parents with stories from her California trip, meetings with tech executives, consultations with venture capital firms, deals that would revolutionize the consulting industry. She spoke with the easy confidence of someone who'd been lying professionally for years, weaving truth and fiction together so seamlessly that even I might have believed her if I didn't know better. Our parents hung on every word, clearly proud of their successful daughter and her glamorous lifestyle. "What about you, Jazmin?" Ashley asked, turning those bright blue eyes on me. "What are your plans now that you're home?" The question felt like a test, and I could sense our parents' tension as they waited for my answer. "I'm taking things slowly," I replied, "figuring out what I want to do with my life. Maybe I'll go back to accounting. Maybe I'll try something completely different." Ashley nodded approvingly. "That's smart. No need to rush into anything. Take your time." Over. The following weeks, I settled into a routine that appeared completely innocent to my family while actually serving my real purpose. I applied for jobs in accounting and finance, went on interviews, and generally behaved like someone trying to rebuild their life after a criminal conviction. But I was also carefully observing Ashley's patterns, noting her travel schedule, monitoring her phone calls, and paying attention to her visitors. Ashley's business operated from a home office in the converted garage, a space she'd claimed was off-limits to family members for client confidentiality reasons. But the garage shared a wall with my bedroom, and prison had taught me to be very quiet and very patient. Late at night, I could hear her on phone calls, speaking in hushed tones about transfers and cleaning protocols and safe delivery methods. She was careful never to use names or specific details, but the general context was clear enough. My parents had adapted their lives around Ashley's criminal activities in ways that were both subtle and profound. They never asked direct questions about her work, never inquired about specific clients or projects, and always accepted her explanations for expensive purchases or sudden travel plans. They'd trained themselves not to see what was directly in front of them, choosing willful ignorance over uncomfortable truths. The first concrete evidence I gathered came by accident. Ashley had left her laptop open in the kitchen while she took a shower, and I happened to walk by just as an encrypted messaging app notification popped up on the screen. The message was from someone called Phoenix Trader, and it read, "Ready to move the Chicago package Tuesday. Usual cleaning fee." I memorized the exact wording and timing, then continued making my breakfast as if I'd seen nothing. That night, I called David from a payphone at a gas station 3 miles from the house. Prison paranoia had taught me to assume that family phones might be monitored, either by law enforcement or by Ashley's criminal associates. "I'm starting to gather intelligence," I told him. "But I need to be extremely careful. If she suspects, I'm working against her. I could end up dead instead of just framed." David had been researching Ashley's known associates while I was getting re-established at home. "The people she's working with now aren't just white-collar criminals," he warned. "These are violent organizations with a history of eliminating problems permanently. If they think you're a threat, prison will seem like a vacation compared to what they'll do to you." The warning sent a chill down my spine, but it also strengthened my resolve. Ashley had put me in danger just by framing me for her crimes. If her associates decided I knew too much, they might come after me regardless of whether I was actively investigating. My job search provided the perfect cover for gathering information about Ashley's financial activities. I applied for positions at several accounting firms and banks, ostensibly to restart my career, but actually to gain access to financial databases and professional networks that might help me trace her money laundering operations. My criminal conviction made getting hired difficult, but it also made my interest in financial crime seem like genuine reform rather than investigative work. One morning, Ashley announced that she'd be traveling to Las Vegas for a week-long client conference. My parents accepted this explanation without question, but I remembered David's earlier observation about her frequent trips to the same casino hotel. This could be my opportunity to gather more substantial evidence while she was out of town. "Have a safe trip," I told her, hugging her goodbye with what I hoped looked like sisterly affection. The moment Ashley's BMW disappeared down Maple Street, I began my real work. Her home office was locked, but prison had taught me a few skills that weren't covered in any accounting curriculum. The lock was a standard residential deadbolt, easily defeated with a credit card and patience. Inside, Ashley's office was a monument to successful criminality: top-of-the-line computer equipment, multiple phones, file cabinets filled with business, documents, and a wall safe that probably contained evidence I could only dream of accessing. I started with the most accessible information: documents left on her desk, papers and unlocked file drawers, anything that might provide insight into her current operations. Ashley was meticulous in her record-keeping, a trait that would ultimately become her downfall. She maintained detailed logs of transactions, client communications, and payment schedules, all carefully organized and cross-referenced. The woman who'd framed me for her crimes had created a comprehensive paper trail of her ongoing criminal enterprise. The names in Ashley's files read like a directory of organized crime. Phoenix Trader was apparently connected to a drug trafficking organization operating between Mexico and Phoenix. Desert Wind seemed to be involved in human trafficking, moving people and money through a network of safe houses and front businesses. Crypto King was running some kind of cryptocurrency fraud that involved stealing digital wallets and converting the funds to untraceable cash. Each client had a specific money laundering protocol tailored to their needs and risk tolerance. Drug money was processed through casino chips and real estate transactions. Human trafficking proceeds were cleaned through fake consulting contracts and nonprofit organizations. Cryptocurrency theft was laundered through online gaming platforms and digital art purchases. Ashley had become a criminal services professional, offering customized solutions for the most dangerous people in America. The amounts of money flowing through Ashley's operation were staggering. In just the past 6 months, she'd processed over $12 million for various criminal organizations, taking a commission of 15% on each transaction. She was earning nearly $2 million per year from activities that funded murder, drug addiction, and human slavery. While I'd been eating prison food and counting days on a calendar, my sister had been getting rich off the suffering of countless victims. But the most damning evidence I found was a folder labeled insurance policy, hidden in the back of a locked file drawer. Inside were detailed records of Ashley's clients, including their real names, addresses, criminal organizations, and the specific illegal activities she was helping them monetize. She was keeping detailed blackmail material on some of the most dangerous criminals in the country, apparently as protection against betrayal or prosecution. The folder also contained communications between Ashley and our parents, emails, and text messages that revealed the true extent of their knowledge about her criminal activities. They weren't innocent victims who'd been fooled by Ashley's lies. They were active participants in her money laundering operation. My father had helped her establish several shell companies using his business connections. My mother had allowed Ashley to use her social security number and credit history to open financial accounts that couldn't be traced directly to Ashley. Most shocking of all was a series of emails between Ashley and my parents discussing my imprisonment. Jazmin is taking this better than expected, Ashley had written. She really believes this is temporary and that we'll find another solution. As long as she stays quiet, we should be fine. My mother had replied, "We're so proud of how she's protecting the family. This sacrifice will bring us all closer together." They'd never intended to clear my name or find another solution. From the beginning, the plan had been to let me serve the full sentence while Ashley expanded her criminal empire under the protection of my sacrifice. I was never family to them. I was a convenient scapegoat whose loyalty could be exploited to protect their real daughter, the one who mattered enough to save. Reading those emails in Ashley's locked office, surrounded by evidence of crimes that had sent me to federal prison, I felt something inside me break permanently. Not my heart. That had broken months ago. What broke was the last vestige of obligation I felt toward the people who'd raised me. They weren't my family anymore. They were criminals who'd used my love against me. And they were about to learn that their biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating law enforcement. Their biggest mistake had been underestimating me. I photographed every document I could find, uploaded the files to an encrypted cloud storage account David had set up for me, and carefully returned everything to its original position. By the time Ashley returned from Las Vegas, I had enough evidence to destroy her criminal empire and send all three of them to federal prison for decades. But I wasn't ready to act yet. I wanted more than just justice. I wanted them to experience the same betrayal and helplessness they'd inflicted on me. Ashley came home from Las Vegas with a tan, expensive jewelry, and stories about successful client meetings. She hugged me warmly and asked about my job search with what seemed like genuine sisterly concern. "Any luck with interviews?" she asked. Over dinner. "A few possibilities," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm learning that sometimes the best opportunities come from the most unexpected places." If she'd been paying attention, Ashley might have noticed the subtle change in my demeanor. Prison had taught me to hide my emotions, to smile while planning revenge, to appear harmless while becoming dangerous. But Ashley was too confident in her control over me, too secure in her belief that family loyalty would always protect her from consequences. She had no idea that her loyal sister was about to become her worst nightmare. The job interview at Morrison & Associates went better than I'd expected. Margaret Morrison, the founding partner, was a sharp woman in her 50s, who'd built her forensic accounting firm from nothing into one of Phoenix's most respected financial investigation companies. She looked at my resume with the kind of attention that made me nervous, lingering on the 18-month gap that I'd explained as pursuing other opportunities. "Miss Miranda," she said, leaning back in her leather chair, "I'm going to be direct with you. I know about your conviction. I know you served time for money laundering." My heart stopped, but she continued. "What I don't know is whether you're someone who made a stupid mistake and learned from it, or someone who's still making stupid mistakes and hoping not to get caught." The honesty was refreshing after weeks of dancing around the subject with other potential employers. "I learned a lot during those 18 months, I replied carefully. "About myself, about the financial system, about how easy it is for good people to get swept up in bad situations." Margaret nodded slowly. "The thing about forensic accounting, Miss Miranda, is that we see the aftermath of every kind of financial crime imaginable. Money laundering, embezzlement, tax fraud, Ponzi schemes. We help law enforcement and civil attorneys unravel the damage and find the money." She offered me a position as a junior forensic accountant, starting immediately. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was being hired to investigate financial crimes while secretly gathering evidence about the very crimes that had sent me to prison. Margaret's firm specialized in exactly the kind of complex money laundering cases that Ashley was running, which meant I'd have access to investigative tools and databases that could help me build an airtight case against my sister. My first week at Morrison & Associates was like attending graduate school in financial crimes. I learned about sophisticated money laundering techniques that made Ashley's operations look crude by comparison. I studied case files involving criminal organizations that moved hundreds of millions of dollars through legitimate businesses, cryptocurrency exchanges, and offshore banking networks. Most importantly, I gained access to professional databases that could trace financial transactions across multiple jurisdictions and institutions. Ashley noticed the change in my schedule immediately. "A forensic accounting firm?" she asked when I told the family about my new job over dinner. "Isn't that a little too close to your previous troubles?" My mother looked concerned. "Maybe you should find something less connected to financial crimes, sweetheart. Something in retail or hospitality where your past won't be an issue." But my father's reaction was different. I caught him studying me with a calculating expression that I'd never seen before. Robert Miranda was a smart man who'd successfully hidden his daughter's criminal activities from federal investigators for years. He understood the implications of having a forensic accountant in the family, especially one who'd already been convicted of the same crimes his other daughter was actively committing. "How much access do you have to law enforcement databases?" he asked casually, cutting his steak with deliberate precision. "Do they monitor what you search for?" The question seemed innocent enough, but I could sense the anxiety underneath. "Everything's monitored and logged," I replied truthfully. "We have to maintain detailed records of every search and investigation for audit purposes." I watched his shoulders relax slightly, apparently satisfied that my activities would be tracked and limited. What my father didn't know was that Margaret Morrison had given me access to private investigative databases that weren't monitored by law enforcement. Morrison and Associates maintained relationships with private investigators, skip tracers, and information brokers who operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal surveillance. These resources were primarily used to locate hidden assets and trace money through legitimate channels. But they could also be used to investigate criminal activities that hadn't yet come to law enforcement's attention. My real education began when Margaret assigned me to assist with a case involving a cryptocurrency fraud scheme that had bilked investors out of $20 million. The perpetrators had used a combination of fake investment platforms, shell companies, and crypto mixing services to hide their stolen funds. As I traced the money through blockchain transactions and corporate filings, I realized that Ashley's cryptocurrency client was using almost identical techniques. Working late one evening, I cross-referenced the blockchain addresses from the E. Morrison case with the wallet information I'd photographed in Ashley's office. The match was unmistakable. Ashley's client, Crypto King, was directly connected to the fraud scheme we were investigating. My sister wasn't just laundering money for random criminals. She was working with suspects in an active federal investigation that could expose her entire operation. This discovery changed everything. If the FBI was already investigating Ashley's client, they would eventually trace the money laundering connection back to her. When that happened, they'd also discover that I was her sister, recently released from prison for similar crimes. I would immediately become a suspect in their investigation, regardless of my actual innocence. Ashley's criminal activities were creating a ticking time bomb that could send me back to prison for crimes I had nothing to do with. I called David that night from a secure phone at the office, using an encrypted communication app that Margaret's firm employed for sensitive cases. "We need to accelerate our timeline," I told him. "Ashley's connected to an active federal investigation. If they find her before we're ready, I could get swept up in the prosecution again." David was quiet for a long moment. "How much evidence do you have so far?" The truth was that I had enough evidence to destroy Ashley's operation, but not enough to guarantee that my parents would face serious consequences for their role in framing me. I wanted all three of them to experience the same helplessness and betrayal that I'd endured. I wanted them to sit in federal custody while their lives fell apart, wondering if anyone would come to save them. But most importantly, I wanted them to know that their own daughter and sister had orchestrated their downfall. "I need something bigger," I told David. something that connects all three of them directly to ongoing criminal activities. The framing. Evidence is historical. Statutes of limitations might protect them from prosecution, but if I can catch them actively participating in new crimes, the federal charges will be unavoidable. David understood immediately. You want to set up a sting operation. The plan we developed was elegant in its simplicity. David would approach Ashley as a potential new client, someone connected to a criminal organization that needed money, laundering services. He'd wear recording equipment and try to get Ashley to incriminate herself on tape while discussing specific illegal activities. If my parents were involved in vetting new clients or managing the business operations, they might also incriminate themselves during the process. But first, I needed to establish the right circumstances for David's approach. Ashley was cautious about taking on new clients, especially after my recent return from prison. She'd been operating with existing clients and avoiding expansion that might attract law enforcement attention. I needed to create a situation where she'd be motivated to take risks, to reach for a score big enough to overcome her natural caution. The opportunity came when I overheard Ashley on a phone call with one of her existing clients. The conversation was heated, with Ashley's voice rising above her usual careful whisper. You can't just change the terms in the middle of a transaction, she was saying. I've already moved the money through 3 different accounts. If you want to renegotiate my fee now, you'll need to find someone else to clean up your mess. After the call ended, Ashley stormed into the kitchen where I was, making coffee. Her face was flushed with anger, and she was muttering under her breath about unreliable partners and ungrateful clients. This was the first time I'd seen her professional composure crack, and it gave me insight into the pressures she was facing. Running a criminal enterprise was apparently more stressful than she'd anticipated. Bad day at the office? I asked sympathetically, offering her a cup of coffee. Ashley looked at me for a moment, seeming to weigh whether she could confide in me. It's just business stress, she said finally. Some clients think they can change the rules after you've done all the work. I nodded understandingly. That's frustrating. I hope you have other opportunities lined up. Ashley's expression shifted, and I could see her calculating mind working through possibilities. Actually, I've been thinking about expanding into new markets. There's a lot of potential business out there, but it requires taking on clients I don't know as well. She was fishing for my opinion, testing whether I'd support her taking additional risks. Sounds like it could be lucrative, I replied. Just make sure you're careful about who you work with. That evening, Ashley called a family meeting in the living room. She explained that she was considering expanding her consulting business into new areas that would require significant upfront investment but could yield much higher returns. I'm talking about the kind of contracts that could set us up for life, she said, her eyes bright with possibility. But I'd need to take on some bigger risks. My parents exchanged one of their wordless communications before my father nodded. Slowly. What kind of risks are we talking about? He asked. Ashley glanced at me before answering, still uncertain about how much she should reveal in my presence. Higher value clients, more complex transactions, potentially some international work. The euphemisms were transparent to anyone who understood her real business, but they maintained the fiction that Ashley was running a legitimate consulting firm. I think you should go for it, I said before my parents could respond. You've been so successful with your current clients. It makes sense to expand when you have momentum. Ashley smiled, clearly pleased by my support. I was hoping you'd say that. Having family backing makes all the difference when you're taking big steps. The irony of her words was almost overwhelming. Ashley thought she was getting my support for expanded criminal activities, when actually I was encouraging her to expose herself to the kind of risks that would bring down her entire operation. My parents were nodding approvingly, proud of their successful daughter's business acumen, and my apparent loyalty to family interests. Over the following days, I helped Ashley research potential new clients and market opportunities, ostensibly to support her business expansion, but actually to gather intelligence about her client vetting process and operational security measures. She was remarkably open about her methods, perhaps viewing my criminal conviction as proof that I was already compromised and therefore safe to confide in. Ashley explained how she evaluated potential clients based on their criminal activities, financial capacity, and risk profile. Drug traffickers were preferred because they generated consistent cash flow and understood operational security. Human traffickers were avoided because their activities attracted too much law enforcement attention. White-collar criminals were ideal because they were already familiar with financial systems and less likely to make mistakes that would expose the operation. The key, Ashley explained, is finding clients who need your services badly enough to pay premium rates, but who aren't so desperate or stupid that they'll bring unwanted attention. She'd developed a sophisticated screening process that involved multiple intermediaries and background checks before she'd even agree to a preliminary meeting. This level of caution was going to make David's approach more challenging than we'd anticipated. I spent my lunch breaks at Morrison & Associates researching the specific techniques that law enforcement use to penetrate money laundering operations. Most successful cases relied on either insider informants or undercover agents who could gain the target's trust over an extended period. The key was establishing credibility through legitimate criminal connections and demonstrating the financial capacity to make cooperation worthwhile. David would need a backstory that could withstand Ashley's scrutiny, criminal references who could vouch for his legitimacy, and a financial problem that required exactly the kind of services Ashley provided. We decided that David would pose as a real estate developer whose construction projects were being used to launder money for a drug trafficking organization. The cover story was complex enough to seem genuine while providing opportunities for Ashley to incriminate herself discussing specific illegal activities. The setup required careful preparation. David established a fake real estate development company with a professional website, legitimate business registration, and a small office in Denver. He created a history of property transactions that could be verified through public records, using money from legitimate sources to make the company appear financially successful. Most importantly, he developed relationships with actual criminals who could serve as references if Ashley decided to verify his criminal connections. Finding criminal references turned out to be easier than expected. David's forensic accounting work had brought him into contact with dozens of convicted financial criminals who were serving reduced sentences in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. Several of them were willing to vouch for David's fictional criminal activities in exchange for favorable recommendations to federal prosecutors reviewing their cases. The plan was for David to approach Ashley through one of these criminal references, someone whose credibility she wouldn't question. The reference would explain that David needed money laundering services for a major real estate project that was being financed with drug money. Ashley would conduct her usual background checks and discover that David was exactly what he appeared to be: a successful developer with legitimate business interests and illegal financial problems. But before we could put the plan into motion, something happened that changed everything. I came home from work one evening to find Ashley pacing in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands shaking. My parents were seated at the kitchen table looking like they'd received devastating news. The atmosphere in the house was thick with barely controlled panic. "What's wrong?" I asked, though I was already forming theories about what might have upset them. Ashley stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, naked fear mixed with desperate calculation. "One of my clients was arrested today," she said. "Federal agents raided his operation and seized everything. Computers, financial records, everything." My stomach clenched as I realized the implications. If federal agents had seized Ashley's client's records, they would eventually discover communications between the client and Ashley. Those communications would lead investigators directly to her money laundering operation, which would expose not only her current crimes but also the conspiracy to frame me for her previous activities. Do they have anything that connects back to you? I asked, trying to sound concerned rather than calculating. Ashley's laugh was bitter and humorless. Everything connects back to me. I processed over $3 million for this guy in the past 6 months alone. When they start following that money trail, they're going to find me within a week. The criminal empire that Ashley had built so carefully was about to collapse, and she knew it. But instead of accepting responsibility for her choices, she was already looking for someone else to blame, someone else to sacrifice. And as her eyes settled on me, I realized that my sister was planning to throw me under the federal bus for the second time in my life. "We need to talk," Ashley said, her voice taking on the same tone she'd used 3 years earlier when she'd first asked me to take the fall for her crimes. "As a family, right now." The family meeting that Ashley called felt like déjà vu from the worst day of my life. We sat in the same living room where they'd convinced me to confess to crimes I hadn't committed, my parents wearing the same expressions of desperate concern mixed with calculating manipulation. But this time, I wasn't the naive graduate student who believed that family loyalty meant anything to these people. This time, I was prepared. Ashley stood by the fireplace like she was delivering a boardroom presentation, her nervous energy barely contained beneath her professional composure. "The situation is more serious than I initially thought," she began, avoiding direct eye contact with me. The client who was arrested had detailed records going back 2 years. Financial transactions, communication logs, everything. My father's face went gray. "How detailed?" "Detailed enough to trace every dollar back to its source," Ashley replied, "which means federal agents are going to be knocking on our door within days, maybe hours." She finally looked at me directly, and I saw the same cold calculation that had destroyed my life 3 years earlier. "We need to get ahead of this before they have time to build a case against all of us." My mother leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you suggesting?" Ashley's smile was thin and predatory. "The same thing that worked last time. Jazmin takes responsibility for the recent transactions, claims she was using her accounting skills to help me launder money without my knowledge. She's already a convicted felon, so additional charges won't destroy her life the way they would destroy mine." The audacity of her proposal took my breath away. Ashley wanted me to confess to crimes she'd committed while I was in federal prison, activities that had taken place while I was locked in a cell 3,000 miles away. She was asking me to claim responsibility for money laundering operations that required me to be in multiple states simultaneously, meeting with clients I'd never heard of, managing accounts I couldn't possibly have accessed. "That doesn't make sense," I said calmly. "I was in prison when most of these transactions took place. There are federal records proving I was incarcerated." Ashley waved dismissively. "We'll say you were coordinating everything through letters and phone calls, using contacts you made in prison to expand the operation. Convicted financial criminals have connections, and everyone knows that prison is where you go to network with other criminals." My father nodded slowly, clearly warming to the idea. "It's actually believable. Jazmin learned about money laundering techniques from other inmates, then used that knowledge to help Ashley expand her consulting business into questionable territory. Ashley was an innocent victim who got manipulated by her criminal sister." The betrayal in his words was absolute, but it no longer had the power to hurt me. These people had shown me exactly who they were 3 years ago. "I won't do it," I said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and I watched their faces shift from expectation to surprise to anger. Ashley's composure cracked first. "What do you mean you won't do it? You did it before. You understood that family comes first." I met her gaze steadily. "Family comes first for some people, but I'm not family to you, am I, Ashley? I'm just a convenient scapegoat." My mother tried a different approach, the same emotional manipulation that had worked so effectively when I was younger. "Sweetheart, you don't understand how serious this is. Ashley could go to prison for decades. her life would be over. Tears started flowing down her cheeks, the same performance that had convinced me to sacrifice myself the first time. You're stronger than she is. You've already survived prison once. She wouldn't last a month in that environment. Then maybe she shouldn't have spent the last 3 years building a criminal empire while I rotted in federal custody, I replied. Maybe she should have used the time I bought her to find a legitimate career instead of expanding into human. Trafficking and drug money. The specificity of my knowledge clearly shocked them. Ashley's eyes narrowed. How do you know about those clients? I smiled for the first time since the conversation began. I know a lot of things, Ashley. I know about Phoenix Trader and Desert Wind and Crypto King. I know about the shell companies Dad helped you establish and the accounts Mom let you open using her information. I know about the 15% commission you charge and the $12 million you've processed in the past year. Most importantly, I know about the insurance policy folder in your office safe. The silence that followed my revelation was deafening. Ashley's face went white as she realized that her carefully guarded secrets were no longer secret. My parents looked confused and terrified, understanding that something fundamental had shifted, but not yet grasping the full implications. I stood up slowly, enjoying the way they instinctively stepped back from me. You see, while you were all living your comfortable lives funded by blood money, I was getting an education in federal prison. I learned about criminal organizations, money laundering techniques, and most importantly, I learned about the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors need to secure convictions. I walked to the window and looked out at the street, half expecting to see FBI surveillance vehicles. I also learned that the statute of limitations doesn't apply to ongoing criminal conspiracies. Ashley found her voice first. You've been spying on us. The accusation was both true and irrelevant. I've been protecting myself, I corrected. Because unlike the rest of you, I understand that federal prosecutors don't care about family, loyalty when they're building cases against criminal organizations. I turned back to face them. Did you really think I'd spend 18 months in prison without wondering how I ended up there? My father tried to regain control of the conversation. Jazmin, whatever you think you know, you need to remember that we're still your family. We can work through this together, but only if we stick together. The desperation in his voice was pathetic. Family, I repeated slowly. Is that what you call it when you forge my signature on financial documents? When you use my identity to open bank accounts for criminal activities? When you coach me to lie to federal investigators about crimes I didn't commit? We were protecting Ashley, my mother protested, and we were protecting you too. If the truth had come out, you would have been charged as an accessory anyway. This way you got minimal time and the family stayed together. The revisionist history they'd constructed to justify their actions was breathtaking in its self-serving absurdity. The truth, I said, pulling out my phone, is about to come out anyway. I showed them the screen, which displayed a secure messaging app. I've been working with federal investigators for the past month. Every conversation we've had, every detail about Ashley's operations, every piece of evidence I've gathered is already in their hands. The lie came easily, a skill I'd learned from watching them manipulate me for years. Ashley lunged for my phone, but I'd anticipated the move and stepped out of reach. You're bluffing, she said, but I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The FBI doesn't work with recently released felons on cases involving their own families. I smiled again. You're right, they don't. But private investigative firms do, and forensic accounting companies definitely do, especially when those firms are working with federal prosecutors on related cases. The revelation that my job at Morrison & Associates wasn't just about rebuilding my career hit them like a physical blow. Ashley sat down heavily, her legs apparently unable to support her weight. You planned this, she whispered. From the moment you got out of prison, you were planning to destroy us. The accusation was accurate, and I saw no reason to deny it. I planned to survive, I corrected. I planned to make sure that when your criminal empire collapsed, I wouldn't get buried in the rubble again. I looked at each of them in turn. Did you really think I'd forgotten about the emails you sent while I was in prison? The ones where you talked about making sure I didn't get access to the family estate? The ones where you discussed how my sacrifice was bringing the family closer. Together? My parents exchanged another one of their wordless communications, this one filled with panic rather than conspiracy. How did you get those emails? My father asked. Ashley's head snapped up. What emails? For the first time since I'd known her, my sister looked genuinely confused rather than calculating. The emails where Mom and Dad discussed how to permanently exclude me from the family inheritance, I explained helpfully. The ones where they worried about what I might do if I ever found out the truth about their involvement in framing me. Ashley, did you know that our parents were never planning to clear my name? They intended for me to serve the full sentence while you built your empire with their active assistance. Ashley turned to stare at our parents, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen her express before. Betrayal, rage, and something that might have been hurt if she were capable of genuine feeling. Is that true? She asked. My mother started crying again, but this time the tears looked real. We had to protect the family, she said. Jazmin was already convicted. There was no point in destroying everyone else's future, too. So you were planning to sacrifice me permanently, Ashley said slowly. Just like you sacrificed Jazmin. When the next crisis came, you would have thrown me away, too. The realization that our parents were capable of betraying both their daughters seemed to genuinely shock her. I almost felt sorry for Ashley in that moment, watching her understand that she'd never been as safe or as valued as she'd believed. We're all family, my father insisted desperately. We can still fix this if we work together. Jazmin, whatever deal you've made with investigators, we can negotiate something better. We have money. We have lawyers. We can fight this. His desperation was amusing, but also enlightening. Even facing the collapse of everything he'd built, Robert Miranda still believed that money and manipulation could solve any problem. I walked to my purse and pulled out a folder that I'd prepared for exactly this moment. Inside were copies of the most damning evidence I'd gathered: financial records showing Ashley's money laundering activities, communications between her and known criminals, documentation of my parents' involvement in the conspiracy to frame me, and most devastatingly, a complete timeline proving that I'd been in federal custody during the period when Ashley's most serious crimes had been committed. I'm not making deals, I said, handing the folder to Ashley. I'm not negotiating. I'm not protecting the family reputation or maintaining the comfortable lies that have sustained this household for 3 years. Ashley opened the folder and began reading, her face growing paler with each page. I'm doing exactly what you taught me to do, Ashley. I'm protecting myself at everyone else's expense. The documents in the folder represented months of careful investigation, cross-referencing, financial records with phone logs, travel receipts, and communication data. I'd used every resource available through Morrison and Associates to build a comprehensive case that would be impossible for federal prosecutors to ignore. More importantly, I'd structured the evidence to clearly demonstrate that I couldn't possibly have been involved in Ashley's recent criminal activities. This is incredibly detailed, Ashley said quietly, still reading through the documentation. How long have you been working on this? The question revealed just how completely she'd underestimated me. While she'd been focused on expanding her criminal empire, I'd been methodically dismantling her operational security and gathering evidence that would send her to federal prison for the rest of her life. Since the day I got out, I replied, honestly. Every phone call you made, every client meeting, every financial transaction, I've been documenting all of it. Did you really think I wouldn't notice the pattern? The same techniques, the same clients, the same arrogant assumption that you were too smart to get caught? I watched her realize that her own sister had been surveilling her for months. My mother was still crying, but now her sobs had an edge of hysteria. "You're destroying your own family," she accused. "Everything we've built, everything we've worked for, you're throwing it all away for revenge." The irony of her words was stunning. They'd built their comfortable lifestyle on the proceeds of criminal activities and my wrongful imprisonment. But somehow I was the one destroying the family. "I'm not destroying anything," I said calmly. "I'm simply revealing what's already been destroyed. This family died the day you decided that Ashley's freedom was worth more than my innocence. Everything that's happened since then has just been covering up the corpse." The harsh truth of my words hung in the air like smoke. Ashley closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Genuine respect mixed with fear. "You're right," she said quietly. "We destroyed you, and we thought we could get away with it because you loved us too much to fight back." She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "We created our own worst enemy, and then invited her to live in our house." "I'm not your enemy," I replied. "I'm justice. I'm the consequence you've been avoiding for 3 years. I'm the debt coming due." I looked at my parents, who were clinging to each other like survivors of a shipwreck. "And I'm the daughter you, raised to be loyal, protective, and dedicated to family values. You just forgot that I learned those values from watching how you treated each other, not how you treated me." The sound of car doors slamming outside drew our attention to the front window. Through the sheer curtains, I could see black SUVs parked along Maple Street and agents in tactical gear positioning themselves around the house. Ashley saw them too, and turned back to me with something that might have been admiration. "You weren't bluffing about federal investigators," she said. "How long have they been watching?" I checked my phone, which showed a message confirming that the raid was proceeding as planned. "They've been watching since I gave them the initial evidence 3 weeks ago. Tonight's conversation was just confirmation that you were planning to frame me again." My parents looked confused and terrified as they processed the revelation that federal agents were surrounding their house. "Jazmin, what have you done?" my mother whispered. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by loud knocking and the announcement that never failed to strike fear into the hearts of criminals everywhere. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, we have a warrant to search these premises and arrest warrants for Ashley Miranda, Robert Miranda, and Linda Miranda. Open the door immediately, or we will enter by force." The announcement was clear and professional, delivered by agents who'd conducted hundreds of similar raids. I walked to the front door and opened it calmly, stepping aside to allow the agents to enter. The lead agent, a woman about my age with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, nodded to me professionally. "Miss Miranda, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Please step outside while we execute the warrants." As I walked past my family toward the door, Ashley called my name. I turned back to look at her one last time, seeing her not as the confident criminal mastermind who'd dominated my life for years, but as a woman who'd finally been outsmarted by someone she'd consistently underestimated. "For what it's worth," she said, "I'm sorry about what we did to you. You didn't deserve it." "No," I agreed. "I didn't. But you deserve what's about to happen to you." I looked at my parents, who were being read their rights by federal agents. "All of you do." And with that, I walked out of the house on Maple Street for the last time, leaving behind the family that had never really been mine and the life that had never really been real. Outside, Agent Sarah Chen was waiting for me with a gentle smile and a cup of coffee that smelled like salvation. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we watched my family being led away in handcuffs. The sight should have been traumatic, but instead I felt nothing but relief and a deep sense of completion. "I'm free," I said, meaning it for the first time in my adult life. Finally, completely free. Agent Chen nodded understandingly. Your testimony and evidence will be crucial to the prosecution, but the case is solid enough that you won't need to carry the burden alone this time. She paused. You know, in 20 years of investigating financial crimes, I've never seen someone turn evidence against their own family. It takes incredible strength. I thought about her words as we drove, away from Maple Street, leaving behind the emergency vehicles and crime scene tape that now decorated my childhood home. Strength wasn't the right word for what I'd done. Strength implied struggle against resistance, but dismantling Ashley's criminal empire had felt more like inevitability than effort. Once I'd decided to stop protecting people who'd never protected me, the rest had simply been a matter of patience and preparation. The real strength had been learning to live without the approval of people who'd never valued me anyway. The real courage had been accepting that some families are too toxic to save, and some loyalty is too expensive to maintain. I'd spent 3 years trying to understand why they'd betrayed me, but the truth was simpler than I'd imagined. They'd betrayed me because they could. Because I'd let them. Because I'd been raised to believe that family was sacred, even when that family was built on lies, crime, and the systematic abuse of trust. But prison had taught me that family isn't about blood or obligation or shared history. Family is about people who would sacrifice for each other, protect each other, and stand by each other when everything falls apart. Ashley, Robert, and Linda Miranda had never been my family. They'd been my captors, keeping me trapped in a system that benefited them at my expense. Tonight, I'd finally broken free from that system and ensured that they would never have the power to hurt anyone else the way they'd hurt me. As Agent Chen drove me to the federal building for debriefing, I thought about what came next. The trials would take months, maybe years. I'd have to testify about Ashley's criminal activities and my parents' role in framing me. I'd have to relive the worst period of my life in front of judges, juries, and defense attorneys who would try to paint me as a vengeful sister seeking to destroy her own family. But I wouldn't be facing it alone this time. I had federal agents who believed in my innocence, prosecutors who understood the complexity of the case, and evidence that was so overwhelming that even the most skilled defense attorneys would struggle to create reasonable doubt. Most importantly, I had the truth on my side. And after 3 years of living with lies, the truth felt like a weapon that could cut through any defense. Margaret Morrison had already assured me that my job would be waiting when the trials were over. David had offered to help me relocate anywhere in the country if I wanted a fresh start. Agent Chen had mentioned victim compensation programs that might help me rebuild my life. For the first time since I'd graduated from college, the future looked like something I could shape rather than something that would happen to me. But more than any external support, I had something that Ashley could never take away from me again. The knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, smart enough to outmaneuver any enemy, and ruthless enough to protect myself when no one else would. Prison had stripped away my naivety and my blind trust in family loyalty, but it had given me something far more valuable in return. It had given me myself, uncompromising and unbreakable, ready to build a life that no one could destroy because it would belong entirely to me. Ashley had taught me that family could be weaponized against you, but she'd also taught me that when you stop caring about disappointing people who were never really on your side, you become dangerous in ways they never expected. Tomorrow, Ashley would wake up in federal custody, facing decades in prison for crimes she actually committed. My parents would begin the process of watching their comfortable retirement disappear into legal fees and asset forfeiture. The house on Maple Street would become evidence in a federal investigation, and the family name would become synonymous with criminal conspiracy and money laundering. But I would wake up free, with a clear conscience and a future that stretched out before me like an open road. For the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, and it had only taken destroying everything I used to believe in to get here. The cost had been high, but some prices are worth paying for freedom. 6 months later, I sat in the witness chair of a federal courthouse, looking directly at Ashley as the prosecutor asked me to identify the defendant. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of overwhelming evidence against her. The confident criminal mastermind who'd once controlled every aspect of my life had been reduced to just another defendant hoping for a plea deal that would never come. "Can you identify the person who forged your signature on these financial documents?" the prosecutor asked, holding up exhibits that represented just a fraction of the evidence against my sister. "Yes," I replied clearly. "That's my sister, Jazmin Miranda." My voice carried through the courtroom without trembling, strong and certain in a way that would have been impossible 3 years earlier. Ashley's defense attorney had tried every strategy imaginable to discredit my testimony. They'd painted me as a vengeful sister seeking to destroy her family out of spite. They'd suggested that I was the real criminal mastermind who'd manipulated my naive sister into illegal activities. They'd even argued that my cooperation with federal investigators was motivated by a desire to reduce my own legal exposure rather than seek justice. But the evidence spoke louder than any defense strategy. Financial records showed conclusively that Ashley's most serious crimes had been committed while I was incarcerated in a federal facility 3,000 miles away. Phone records proved that she'd been coordinating with criminal organizations during periods when I had no access to outside communication. Most damaging of all, the recordings I'd made of our final family meeting captured Ashley explicitly admitting to framing me for her previous crimes. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts: conspiracy to commit money laundering, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The judge sentenced Ashley to 28 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. She would be 62 years old before she could even apply for early release. My parents had accepted plea deals rather than risk trial, but their sentences were still substantial. Robert received 12 years for his role in establishing shell companies and falsifying business documents. Linda got 8 years for identity theft and conspiracy charges related to using her personal information to facilitate Ashley's money laundering operations. The comfortable retirement they'd planned to fund with criminal proceeds had been replaced by the prospect of spending their golden years in federal custody. The asset forfeiture proceedings had been swift and comprehensive. The house on Maple Street was seized and sold, with the proceeds going to compensate victims of the criminal organizations that Ashley had served. Her BMW, designer clothes, expensive jewelry, and all the other trappings of her criminal success were liquidated to satisfy restitution orders. Even my parents' retirement accounts were frozen pending final determination of which assets represented legitimate savings versus criminal proceeds. Standing outside the courthouse after Ashley's sentencing, Agent Chen handed me a check representing my portion of the federal reward program for providing information that led to the conviction of a major criminal enterprise. The amount was substantial enough to restart my life anywhere I chose, free from the financial constraints that had once made me vulnerable to my family's manipulation. "Any thoughts on what comes next?" Agent Chen asked as we watched the news. Crews interviewing federal prosecutors about the successful conclusion of their investigation. The case had attracted significant media attention, partly because of its complexity, but mainly because of the unusual circumstances of a family member orchestrating the downfall of her own criminal relatives. I'd been thinking about that question for months, ever since the night Ashley was arrested. The obvious choice would be to disappear, change my name, move to a different state where nobody knew my history, and try to build a normal life far away from the wreckage of my past. But the more I considered that option, the less appealing it became. Running away felt too much like the old Jazmin, the woman who'd been willing to sacrifice herself to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths. "I think I want to stay in Phoenix," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I have a good job, supportive colleagues, and for the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Agent Chen smiled approvingly. "That takes courage. Most people would want to start fresh somewhere else. But starting fresh would mean abandoning the life I'd fought so hard to reclaim, and I wasn't willing to let Ashley's crimes drive me away from the home I'd rebuilt for myself. Margaret Morrison had been incredibly supportive throughout the trial proceedings, adjusting my work schedule to accommodate court appearances and offering me extended leave if I needed time to process everything that had happened. But work had actually been my salvation during the most difficult months, providing structure and purpose while my family's crimes dominated local news coverage. "I have a proposition for you," Margaret said when I returned to the office after Ashley's sentencing. "The FBI has asked us to consult on several cases involving family-based money laundering operations. Apparently, your insights into how these conspiracies develop and operate within households could be valuable for other investigations." The irony wasn't lost on me. My traumatic experience with family betrayal had inadvertently made me an expert in detecting similar crimes. The consulting work turned out to be both challenging and therapeutic. I helped federal investigators understand the psychological dynamics that allowed criminal conspiracies to flourish within families, the warning signs that indicated when legitimate businesses were being used for money laundering, and the evidence patterns that distinguished between victims and willing participants in financial crimes. Each case taught me something new about the complexity of human relationships and the various ways that trust could be weaponized against innocent people. I worked with investigators on cases involving elderly parents whose adult children had stolen their identities to facilitate drug trafficking, spouses who'd used joint accounts to launder money for human trafficking organizations, and even cases where teenagers had been recruited by family members to open bank accounts for criminal enterprises. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying in ways I hadn't expected. Every successful prosecution felt like validation that my decision to cooperate with federal investigators had been correct, not just for my own situation, but for all the other victims whose stories were similar to mine. I was helping to ensure that other families couldn't use love and loyalty as weapons against their most vulnerable members. My personal life began to stabilize as well. The media attention from Ashley's trial gradually faded, replaced by newer scandals and more current criminal cases. Phoenix was a large enough city that I could live anonymously most of the time, though occasionally I'd encounter someone who recognized me from news coverage of the case. Most people were supportive, viewing me as a whistleblower who'd courageously exposed criminal activity despite personal cost. David had become a close friend and trusted confidant, one of the few people who truly understood the complexity of what I'd experienced. He'd testified during Ashley's trial about his role in gathering evidence, and his forensic accounting expertise had been crucial to explaining the technical aspects of money laundering to the jury. More importantly, he'd been someone I could talk to during the darkest moments of the investigation and trial. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked during one of our monthly dinners, about a year after Ashley's conviction. "Turning them in, I mean. Despite everything they did, they were still your family." It was a question I'd asked myself countless times, particularly during the lonely nights when the weight of my decisions felt overwhelming. "I regret that it was necessary," I replied honestly. "I regret that they chose crime over legitimate success, that they chose to sacrifice me rather than face consequences for their choices, and that they never saw me as family in the same way I saw them." I paused, considering my words carefully. "But I don't regret exposing them. They destroyed innocent lives, including mine, and they would have continued destroying lives if I hadn't stopped them." The truth was more complicated than my simple answer suggested. There were moments when I missed the illusion of family that had sustained me for so many years, even though I now understood that it had always been an illusion. I missed believing that I belonged somewhere, that there were people who would protect me unconditionally. That love was something I could count on rather than something that could be used against me. But I didn't miss the constant anxiety of trying to earn approval from people who would never value me. I didn't miss the exhausting work of maintaining relationships that were fundamentally one-sided. Most importantly, I didn't miss the version of myself who'd been willing to accept crumbs of affection in exchange for total submission to other people's needs and desires. The woman I'd become through this experience was harder than the naive graduate student who'd once trusted her family implicitly, but she was also stronger, more self-reliant, and more capable of genuine relationships based on mutual respect, rather than obligation. I'd learned to distinguish between people who cared about me and people who cared about what I could do for them, a skill that had already prevented me from making similar mistakes in my new life. 3 years after Ashley's conviction, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. The return address showed it was from the federal correctional institution where she was serving her sentence, and I recognized her handwriting immediately despite the years that had passed. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity eventually won out over caution. The letter was shorter than I'd expected, and surprisingly free of the manipulation that had characterized most of our previous communications. Ashley wrote that she'd been participating in educational programs during her incarceration, studying business administration and psychology in an effort to understand how she'd become the person who'd destroyed so many lives. She acknowledged that her crimes had been inexcusable and that the damage she'd caused couldn't be undone by good intentions or belated remorse. "I don't expect forgiveness," she wrote, "and I'm not asking for anything from you. But I wanted you to know that I understand now what I took from you, and I'm sorry in ways that words can't express. You deserved a family that protected you, not one that sacrificed you for convenience. You deserved parents who valued your integrity, not ones who saw it as a weakness to exploit. Most of all, you deserved a sister who would have gone to prison herself before letting you take the fall for her crimes." The letter concluded with an admission that felt more honest than anything Ashley had ever said to me. "I know you'll probably never read this, and I know I don't have the right to ask for your thoughts or your time, but if you ever want to write back, I'd like to hear about the life you've built without us. I hope it's everything ours never was, honest, peaceful, and filled with people who deserve your loyalty because they've earned it rather than demanded it." I set the letter aside and didn't respond immediately, taking time to process the emotions it had stirred up. Part of me was skeptical about Ashley's apparent transformation, wondering if this was just another manipulation designed to make me feel sorry for her. But another part of me recognized something genuine in her words, a level of self-awareness that she'd never demonstrated before her imprisonment. Eventually, I wrote a brief reply acknowledging her letter and confirming that I was building the kind of life she'd described. I didn't offer forgiveness because forgiveness felt premature and possibly dishonest. But I also didn't express continued anger, because anger had served its purpose in motivating me to seek justice, and holding on to it now would only poison the life I was trying to build. "I hope your educational programs help you become someone who could never commit the crimes you committed," I wrote. "Not for my sake, but for the sake of anyone else whose life you might touch when you're eventually released. The most important thing you can do now is make sure that what happened to our family never happens to anyone else's family." We began exchanging letters every few months, tentative communications that focused on personal growth and reflection rather than attempts to rebuild our relationship. Ashley wrote about her educational progress, her work in the prison law library helping other inmates with appeals, and her gradual understanding of how criminal thinking patterns had corrupted her judgment for years before her arrest. I wrote about my consulting work with federal investigators, my growing expertise in financial crimes detection, and the satisfaction I found in helping other victims get justice. I told her about Margaret Morrison's decision to make me a partner in the firm, recognizing my specialized knowledge and successful track record with complex cases. I even mentioned David, who'd become something more than a friend as we'd worked together on various investigations. The correspondence with Ashley served an unexpected purpose in my healing process. It allowed me to separate the sister I'd once loved from the criminal who'd destroyed my life, recognizing that people could be both victims and perpetrators, both family and enemies, both worthy of compassion and deserving of consequences. Ashley was serving an appropriate sentence for her crimes, but she was also working to become someone who wouldn't commit those crimes again. My parents had never written to me from prison, and I suspected they never would. Their plea agreements had included admissions of guilt, but I doubted they'd achieved the same level of self-awareness that Ashley seemed to be developing. They were probably still telling themselves that they'd been protecting their family, that circumstances had forced them into impossible choices, that they'd been victims of Ashley's manipulation rather than willing participants in criminal conspiracy. The difference between Ashley's response to imprisonment and my parents' response told me everything I needed to know about who they really were and who they'd always been. Ashley had been a criminal, but she'd also been someone capable of growth and change when forced to confront the consequences of her actions. My parents had been enablers and conspirators, people who'd chosen comfort over conscience and would probably continue making that choice even in federal custody. 5 years after the trials ended, I was testifying before a congressional subcommittee about the need for stronger federal legislation targeting family-based financial crimes. The expertise I'd developed through my own traumatic experience had evolved into a national reputation for understanding how criminal organizations exploited family relationships to avoid detection and prosecution. The challenge with family-based money laundering operations, I explained to the assembled congressmen, is that they rely on emotional bonds and social expectations that make victims reluctant to report crimes or cooperate with investigations. Traditional law enforcement approaches often fail because they don't account for the psychological complexity of family relationships. My recommendations included enhanced protections for family members who reported financial crimes, expanded victim compensation programs, and specialized training for investigators working on cases involving domestic criminal conspiracies. Several of my suggestions were eventually incorporated into federal legislation that strengthened prosecutors' ability to pursue family-based money laundering operations. The congressional testimony represented a milestone in my transformation, from victim to advocate. I'd spent years learning to understand and articulate the dynamics that had destroyed my original family, and now I was using that knowledge to help other victims and prevent similar crimes. The expertise that had come from my most painful experiences was being channeled into something productive and meaningful. Standing in the congressional hearing room, answering questions from lawmakers about criminal justice policy, I thought about the path that had brought me to this moment. I'd started as a naive graduate student who'd believed that family loyalty required self-sacrifice. I'd been transformed by betrayal and imprisonment into someone who understood that real loyalty meant protecting innocent people from predators, even when those predators shared your DNA. The woman testifying before Congress bore little resemblance to the frightened young woman who'd once confessed to crimes she hadn't committed. This version of myself was confident, articulate, and absolutely certain about the difference between right and wrong. She'd been forged in federal prison, hardened by betrayal, and refined by the careful work of building a life based on truth rather than comfortable lies. After the hearing ended, I walked out of the Capitol building into the warm Washington sunshine, thinking about how much my life had changed and how much it had stayed the same. I was still an accountant, still someone who found satisfaction in making sense of complex financial information. But now I was using those skills to pursue justice rather than simply processing numbers for other people's benefit. I was still someone who valued family, but my definition of family had evolved to include people who'd chosen to love and support me rather than people who'd been assigned that role by accident of birth. David had proposed 6 months earlier, and we were planning a small wedding focused on celebrating our future together rather than performing for an audience. Margaret Morrison would walk me down the aisle, having become the kind of mentor and mother figure I'd never had growing up. The guest list would be small but meaningful. Federal agents who'd supported me through the investigation, colleagues who'd become friends, and a few carefully chosen family members who'd reached out after learning about the crimes committed in our name. My Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, had been horrified to learn about the conspiracy and had offered to help me rebuild connections with relatives who'd been kept in the dark about Ashley's criminal activities. Most importantly, the wedding would represent the kind of honest relationship I'd never experienced during my childhood. Two people who'd chosen each other freely, who supported each other's growth and success, who shared values and goals and dreams for the future. David understood my history without being defined by it, respected my strength without feeling threatened by it, and loved me for who I'd become rather than who I'd once been. Standing outside the Capitol, I pulled out my phone to call David and tell him about the hearing. As I waited for him to answer, I realized that I was genuinely happy for the first time in my adult life. Not the desperate happiness of someone trying to convince herself that everything was fine, but the quiet contentment of someone who'd built a life that reflected her values and supported her dreams. "How did it go?" David asked when he picked up. "They listened," I replied. "They understood. I think we might actually see some changes in how these cases are prosecuted." We talked for a few minutes about the hearing and our plans for dinner that evening. The comfortable conversation of two people who trusted each other completely. After ending the call, I stood for a moment longer in the Washington sunshine, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. I'd lost the family I'd been born into, but I'd gained something more valuable: the ability to choose my own family based on love, respect, and shared values rather than biological. Accident and social obligation. The cost had been enormous, but the life I'd built from the wreckage was worth every difficult moment. I was exactly who I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by people who valued me for the right reasons. Ashley had taught me that families could be weapons used against you, but she'd also taught me that when you stopped caring about disappointing the wrong people, you became free to find the right people. Sometimes the most important lesson we can learn is that some relationships are too toxic to save, and some loyalties are too expensive to maintain. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk away from people who claim to love us, but treat us like enemies. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the freedom to build a life that belongs entirely to us. I'd learned all those lessons the hard way, but I'd learned them completely. And now, walking toward my future with clear eyes and an unbreakable spirit, I knew that I would never again mistake manipulation for love, obligation for loyalty, or family labels for genuine care. The woman who walked away from the Capitol that day was someone Ashley could never have imagined when she'd first asked me to take the fall for her crimes. She was someone my parents could never have controlled when they'd decided to sacrifice me for their comfort. Most importantly, she was someone I could be proud of, someone who'd turned unimaginable betrayal into unshakable strength. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.